The land did not care. It stretched on for a lifetime in every direction. A flat, gray-green sea of sagebrush under a sky so pale it looked as if all the color had been bleached out of it. The only break in the monotony was the far-off horizon where the mountains stood like the jagged, broken teeth of some ancient animal. The silence was a physical thing, a weight in the air broken only by the tireless sigh of the wind and the steady, rhythmic plod of his horse's hooves in the dust. 1, 2, 3, 4. A sound that had measured out his days for more weeks than he cared to count. The man on the horse, Silas Blackwood, was in his late 20s, but a hard life had carved lines around his eyes and mouth that belonged to someone 20 years older. He wore his clothes not for show, but for purpose. A dusty, wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that had been burned by the sun and scoured by the wind. A long, canvas duster, faded to the color of the earth itself, covered a simple flannel shirt and worn denim trousers. Everything about him was economical, from the way he shifted his weight in the saddle to the slow, deliberate way he scanned the endless plains. He was a man who had learned to conserve everything: energy, words, hope, because he knew how quickly the wilderness, and the men in it, could take it all away. His horse, a tough buckskin gelding named Dust, walked with its head low, as weary as its rider. They were a single, lonely entity moving through an indifferent world. Silas's thoughts were not of the trail ahead or the one behind, but of things he could not outride. They came in fragments, sharp and unwelcome as stones in a boot. The smell of wood smoke on a cool evening, not from a campfire, but from a house. The impossible smallness of a child's hand wrapped around his finger. The terrible, hungry orange of a fire blooming against a night sky. A blossom of pure destruction that had consumed his world. The memories never came as a whole story, only as these punishing shards of sensation. They were the ghosts he carried, the reason he kept moving. He was not looking for a new life. Not anymore. He was just looking for a place where the ghosts might be quiet for a while. He crested a low rise and saw it. Redemption Creek. The town did not stand proudly on the plains. It crouched, as if trying to make itself a smaller target for the wind. It was a haphazard collection of weathered, unpainted buildings huddled along a single, wide street of packed dirt. The whole place had the look of something temporary, a foothold against the vast emptiness that might be swallowed back up at any moment. As he rode closer, he could feel the town before he could properly see its details. A tension hung in the air, thick and gritty as the dust. He guided Dust down the main street, and the town's quiet rhythm faltered. Men leaning against the support posts of the covered boardwalk stopped talking. Their conversations died in their throats, and their eyes followed him, lingering with a cold, unwelcoming suspicion. A woman herding 2 small children across the street pulled them back onto the boardwalk, clutching their shoulders as if he were a plague wind. Silas felt the familiar weight of being the stranger, the outsider. It was a role he had played in a dozen other towns just like this one, and he had long since accepted it. He saw the lines of the town's life drawn as clearly as if they were fences. The cattlemen with their high-heeled boots and confident swagger, who owned the town and everyone in it. The weary laborers and homesteaders, their shoulders stooped, their faces showing the deference of men who knew their place. And then there were the others, the ones who did not quite fit, who moved along the edges of things, nearly invisible. The sounds of the town were as harsh as its glares. The grating protest of a wagon wheel in need of grease, the sharp, angry crack of a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil. The burst of laughter from the saloon was loud but held no real humor, only a kind of bitter mockery. Silas dismounted in front of the building marked General Store. The wood sign so faded the letters were barely legible. He tied Dust to the hitching rail, his movements slow and deliberate, giving the horse a familiar pat on the neck. His senses were on high alert, cataloging the faces in the windows, the mood of the men on the street, the location of the sheriff's office down the way. He was not looking for trouble. but he had learned that trouble often went looking for men like him. Inside the store, the air was thick and stale, a mix of smells that spoke of survival and small comforts. The earthy scent of coffee beans, the sharp tang of cured leather, the dry perfume of sacked flour, and over it all, the ever-present dust. Shelves groaned under the weight of tinned goods, bolts of cloth, tools, and patent medicines. Silas moved with a quiet purpose that drew the eye of the proprietor, a portly, balding man named Gable, who watched him from behind the counter with small, shrewd eyes. Silas ignored the stare and gathered what he needed: a small sack of flour, another of salt, a pound of coffee beans, and 2 boxes of cartridges for his Colt. He placed the items on the counter, his movements making almost no sound. It was then that he saw her. She was standing at the far end of the counter, her back mostly to him, a slight figure in a simple, faded calico dress. She was trying to buy a small bag of oats, but Gable was pointedly ignoring her. He wiped the already clean countertop with a slow, deliberate motion, then turned to serve a grizzled trapper who had entered after she had. The woman did not move. Her posture was ramrod straight, a silent declaration of a pride that refused to be broken. But Silas, whose life had taught him to notice the small details, saw the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched a worn leather coin purse. He could see the line of her jaw and her high cheekbones. Her hair was straight and black as a raven's wing, pulled back in a single, thick braid that fell to the small of her back. In a town of pale, sun-weathered faces, these small features were enough to mark her, to set her apart. She said nothing, did not complain about the slight. She just waited, her patience a shield against the casual cruelty of the place. Silas watched the quiet, demeaning little scene unfold, and he felt a familiar, unwelcome anger begin to stir in the pit of his stomach. It was the anger of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness and was tired of it, but knew better than to get involved. Finally, the trapper paid and left. Gable turned his attention to the woman with an air of profound reluctance. He took her coin, shoveled a meager portion of oats into a burlap sack, and shoved it across the counter with a dismissive grunt. The transaction was complete. The woman, Ilara Vance, turned to leave, her face a mask of composed indifference. She stepped out onto the boardwalk and into the path of 3 men who had been loitering near the door. The man in the center was big, a fleshy slab of a man named Jed Cale, the sheriff's deputy. A tin star was pinned crookedly to his vest, but he wore it less as a symbol of the law and more as a license for his own brand of brutishness. The 2 men with him were cut from the same rough cloth, their faces slack with ignorance and cheap whiskey. They blocked her way, smirking. "Well now," Jed Cale drawled, his voice thick and unpleasant. "Look what we got here. What's a lady like you doing in our town all alone?" His words were not clever. They were crude and heavy with insinuation. The taunts that followed were worse, jabbing at her mixed blood, at the fact that she was different. They called her things meant to strip away her dignity, to remind her that, in their eyes, she was less than nothing. They questioned her right to even be there, on their street, in their town. Ilara's face remained a stoic mask, but Silas, watching from the shadowed doorway of the store, saw what the men on the boardwalk did not. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a deep exhaustion that went far beyond this single moment. It was the weariness of a lifetime of such encounters. He had meant to pay for his supplies, mount his horse, and ride on. He had meant to leave Redemption Creek and its casual cruelty behind him in the dust. His mind was set on it, but his body made a different decision. He did not stride out like some hero from a dime novel. He did not call out a challenge. He simply stepped out of the doorway and into their space. His presence was a sudden, quiet obstacle, a shift in the fabric of the afternoon. He moved without a sound, and for a moment, they did not even notice him. When Jed Cale finally turned, his tirade cut short. He looked surprised. Silas did not look at Ilara. He fixed his gaze on the deputy, and his eyes were flat and unreadable as river stones. "She's leaving," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it was a low rumble that cut through the afternoon air. "Let her pass." Jed, thrown off balance by the interruption from this dusty stranger, turned his full, brutish attention on Silas. He puffed out his fleshy chest, a bull preparing to charge. He looked Silas up and down, taking in the worn duster and the travel-stained clothes. He saw a drifter, a nobody. He scoffed, a wet, ugly sound. "And who are you to be giving orders?" Jed sneered. He took a half-step forward, trying to use his size to intimidate. He let his hand drop, to rest casually on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. It was a practiced, bullying gesture he had used 100 times. But this time, it did not work. There was a coldness in the stranger's eyes that gave Jed a moment's pause. It was a look that spoke of a deep and personal familiarity with violence, a quiet competence that Jed's loud posturing had never truly tested. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and was therefore unafraid of anything Jed Cale could do to him. The standoff was brief, but the air crackled with a tension that was sharp and real. Jed's two friends shuffled their feet, their drunken confidence suddenly evaporating. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of this quiet man who did not seem to fear the deputy. Jed held Silas's gaze for another long second. Then the bluster seemed to leak out of him. He was a bully, and bullies only pressed their advantage when they were certain they would win. Here, he was not certain. With a snarled curse, he stepped aside. As Alara moved to pass, he spat on the ground near her feet. A final, petty act of contempt. "This ain't over," he muttered. The promise directed as much at Silas as it was at her. Alara did not look back. She gave Silas a quick, guarded glance, her dark eyes a swirling mixture of gratitude and a new apprehension. Then, clutching her small sack of oats, she hurried down the street and disappeared around a corner. She had not said a word. Silas watched her go, then slowly turned his gaze back to Jed Cale. He held it for a moment longer, a silent, final warning. Then he turned, walked to his own horse, and untied the reins. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that he had just made a powerful enemy. He knew he had just tied his own fate, for better or for worse, to that of the woman with the proud shoulders and the frightened eyes. He rode out of town later that day, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the jagged mountains. But he did not ride far. A few miles out, in a small hollow sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods, he made a cold camp. He unsaddled Dust and let him graze while he built a small, smokeless fire and brewed a pot of coffee. The encounter in town replayed in his mind, over and over. He told himself it was none of his business. He should have kept his mouth shut, paid for his things, and kept riding south. Getting involved was a mistake, the kind of mistake that got men killed. But the image of Alara's face would not leave him. He kept seeing the fear she had tried so hard to hide beneath her pride. It reminded him of other faces, of other people he had failed to protect. It stirred the ashes of a grief he thought had long gone cold. He spent a restless night under a vast, black sky filled with cold, unblinking stars, the ghosts whispering just at the edge of his hearing. The next morning, driven by a conscience he could no longer ignore, he saddled Dust and rode not south, but back in the direction of the town. He skirted Redemption Creek and made for the Henderson Ranch, a sprawling property he had passed on his way in. The owner, Abel Henderson, was a gnarled, elderly man with skin like tanned leather and eyes that were as sharp and discerning as a hawk's. He looked as though he had grown out of the land itself. Henderson was leaning against a corral fence, watching a young hand try and fail to gentle a wild-eyed colt. He watched Silas approach, his expression unreadable. "Looking for something?" Henderson asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Work," Silas said simply. Henderson looked him over, a long, appraising gaze. He did not ask Silas where he was from or what his story was. He asked him if he knew horses, if he could mend a fence, if he was afraid of hard work and long days. Silas answered each question with a simple yes or no. Henderson seemed to be a man who had survived decades in this unforgiving country by being a keen judge of character. And he saw something in Silas. He saw the competence in his rough, calloused hands and the quiet honesty in his direct gaze. He also saw the deep well of sorrow that lay behind his eyes. "All right," Henderson said finally. "Pays 30 a month and found. Bunkhouse is over there. You can start by helping that boy before he gets himself killed." He paused, then looked toward the town. His voice dropped. "I heard what happened yesterday. That was Jed Cale you crossed, the sheriff's brother. They run this valley. A man's best to keep his head down here." Silas just nodded, his expression unchanging. "I appreciate the work, Mr." In the days that followed, Silas threw himself into the hard, physical labor of the ranch. The work was grueling, bone-wearying, and exactly what he needed. He mended fences for miles under a relentless sun, the sweat stinging his eyes. He broke horses, a dangerous dance of patience and strength. He helped drive cattle from one parched patch of grazing land to another. The physical exhaustion was a welcome anesthetic for his mind, a way to keep the ghosts at bay. He kept to himself, speaking little to the other ranch hands. They, in turn, treated him with a mixture of respect for his skill and suspicion for his quiet, watchful reticence. From the high pastures of the Henderson Ranch, he could sometimes see a thin plume of white smoke rising from a chimney on the outskirts of town. He knew it was her cabin. He learned from snippets of conversation in the bunkhouse that the small plot of land belonged to Alara Vance, that it had been her mother's, part of an old treaty allotment that many of the townsfolk, especially the Cales, resented and coveted. Sometimes he would see her from a distance, a solitary figure tending a small garden next to her cabin. He watched her move with a quiet grace and a fierce determination, coaxing life from the dry, unforgiving soil. He felt a powerful, protective urge swell in his chest, an instinct he immediately tried to suppress. He knew that any connection to him, the stranger who had publicly crossed the sheriff's brother, would only bring her more trouble, more pain. He was a man who believed he brought ruin to those he allowed himself to care for. He had learned that lesson in the heart of a fire, and he was determined not to let it happen again. A week after Silas started at the Henderson Ranch, a rider approached. It was not a dusty cowhand or a hopeful prospector. This man rode a fine, black gelding with a silver-inlaid saddle, and he sat the horse with an easy, proprietary air. He was lean and wore a well-tailored suit and a clean, black hat, unlike his lumbering brother. Sheriff Brody Cale was polished to a high sheen, a veneer of civility that was as thin and brittle as ice on a winter puddle. He did not come with a posse. He came alone, a calculated performance to frame his visit as a simple, official matter between men of standing. He found Silas by the main corral, replacing a splintered rail. Silas had heard the horse approaching and had straightened up, hammer in hand, his body calm but his senses alert. Brody Cale dismounted with a fluid grace and looped his reins over the fence, his movements unhurried. He smiled, a tight, precise motion of the lips that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Good morning," the sheriff said, his voice as smooth as silk. "You must be Mr. Blackwood. I am Sheriff Cale. Welcome to Redemption Creek." Silas nodded once. "Sheriff?" He made no move to shake the man's hand, instead turning back to his work, testing the new rail for sturdiness. Brody Cale's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He strolled closer, resting his gloved hands on the top rail of the fence. "I trust you are finding the work to your satisfaction. Mr. Henderson runs a fine operation." "It's honest work," Silas replied, his voice even. "Indeed." Brody paused, letting the silence stretch. "I understand there was a small misunderstanding in town the day you arrived, a local dispute. My brother Jed can be overzealous at times. He framed it as a triviality, a minor local squabble that a man of the world like Silas would surely understand. Silas selected a nail from the pouch at his belt and set its point against the wood. He did not look at the sheriff. Brody's voice lost some of its manufactured warmth, taking on a harder edge. "We have our own way of doing things in Redemption Creek, Mr. Blackwood, our own customs. Outsiders sometimes find them difficult to understand." He let the words hang in the air, each one weighted with menace. It is often best for everyone if they just move on before any further, more serious misunderstandings can occur. The threat was as clear as a gunshot in the quiet morning air. A lesser man might have bristled, or argued, or shown some sign of fear. Silas did none of those things. He raised his hammer and, with a single, steady blow, drove the nail deep into the post. The sharp crack of the impact was his only reply. He set another nail. He finally turned his head and met Brody's gaze. His eyes were clear and direct, holding no anger and no fear, only a flat, unwavering resolve. "I am just here to work." "Sheriff," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I will stay as long as Mr. Henderson needs me." The quiet defiance was a slap in the face. Brody's mask of civility cracked, and, for a fleeting second, Silas saw the raw, predatory viciousness that lay beneath. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. He had expected fear, or at least submission. He had gotten neither. He quickly composed himself, forcing the tight smile back onto his lips. "As you wish," he said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. He tipped his hat, a gesture of pure mockery, and turned back to his horse. The encounter, brief as it was, had solidified his view. Silas Blackwood was not just a drifter. He was a problem that would need to be solved. The consequences of that brief conversation, and of Silas's continued presence, fell not on him but on Ilara. Her already tenuous connection to the town was severed, strand by strand. The town's quiet ostracism intensified into a campaign of active, grinding persecution. She had been loosely associated with the man who stood up to the Cales, and for that, she would pay the price. When she went into the general store a few days later, her small list in hand, Gable, the proprietor, barely looked at her. "Sorry, miss," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "We are clean out of flour today. And coffee. Supply wagon is late." She could see a dozen sacks of flour stacked against the back wall. She said nothing, her pride a fragile shield, and left with only a small bag of salt. The blacksmith, a burly man who had once been civil enough, suddenly could not find the time to mend the broken handle of her garden hoe. "Too busy," he grunted, turning his back on her to hammer at a glowing piece of iron, though his forge had been cold when she arrived. The cruelty of the women was quieter, but cut just as deep. They would fall silent when she passed on the boardwalk, pulling their children closer as if she carried a disease. They would wait until she was just a few paces away, then resume their conversations in loud, carrying whispers, the insults about her heritage just clear enough for her to hear, each word a carefully aimed stone. The psychological weight of it was immense. She felt as though she were moving through a world made of glass, where everyone could see her, judge her, but she could not touch or connect with anyone. Her composure, which she had spent a lifetime building, became a heavy, exhausting burden to carry each day. She would walk through town with her head held high, her face a mask of serene indifference, but inside, she felt herself shrinking, crumbling. Her small cabin on the edge of town, which had always been her sanctuary, a place of peace built by her mother's hands, began to feel like a prison. It was a fortress she built her walls up in each night, but one she was becoming increasingly afraid to leave. The loneliness was a physical ache in her chest, a cold, creeping thing that threatened to consume her entirely. From his work on the ranch, Silas witnessed this slow, deliberate crushing of her spirit, and it tormented him. He saw her walk away from the store empty-handed. He heard the whispers of the other ranch hands, repeating the ugly gossip that filtered out from town. Every fresh insult directed at her felt like a blow against him, and his inability to intervene directly without making things 10 times worse was a constant, bitter frustration. He could not confront the whispers or force the blacksmith to be a decent man. To do so would only confirm the town's suspicion of their connection and bring more of the Cales' wrath down upon her. So he chose to fight back in the only way he could, with small, clandestine acts of support, silent messages across the hostile distance. One morning, Alara opened her cabin door to find a brace of freshly dressed rabbits and a small bundle of wild sage and thyme lying on her doorstep. They had been left sometime in the deep, pre-dawn dark, a gift of sustenance from a ghost. She knew, with a certainty that made her heart ache, who had left them. Another day. Jed Cale was holding court outside the saloon, his voice loud and drunkenly boastful as he recounted a fabricated story of his own bravery. When he went to heave his considerable bulk onto his long-suffering horse, the cinch strap, which had been perfectly tight moments before, mysteriously gave way. The saddle slid sideways, and the deputy tumbled ungracefully into the thick dust of the street. A wave of barely suppressed laughter rippled through the onlookers, a rare moment of public humiliation for the town bully. Silas was miles away, mending a fence line, but the message was as clear as if he had signed his name to it. These were small acts of defiance, tiny sparks of warmth against the encroaching cold. For Alara, they were lifelines. They were proof that in the entire hostile world of Redemption Creek, she was not entirely alone. The conflict escalated, as Silas knew it would. It moved beyond whispers and petty denials into something uglier. Alara's garden was the one small piece of the world that was truly hers. She had tended it with a meticulous, loving care, coaxing life from the dry, unforgiving soil. It was more than just a source of food. It was a source of pride, a living connection to the memory of her mother, who had taught her which plants would thrive and how to listen to the needs of the earth. She woke one morning to a scene of total devastation. The rows of young corn were trampled and broken. Her carefully tended squash and bean plants were ripped from the ground, their roots exposed to the killing sun. The vegetable beds had been churned into a muddy, chaotic ruin, the tracks of heavy boots scarring the earth. The destruction was not the work of animals. It was petty and wantonly cruel, an act of spite designed to destroy not just her food, but her hope. There was no doubt in her mind who was responsible. Silas was riding the northern fence line of Henderson's property when he saw it. He reined in his horse, his gut clenching into a cold, hard knot of fury. From a distance, he could see the wreckage of the garden and the small, still figure kneeling in the middle of it. He spurred his horse forward, foregoing the trail and cutting straight across the sagebrush. He found her there, kneeling in the dirt. She was not crying. Her face was pale and still, her eyes fixed on the ruin of a tomato vine, its green fruit smashed into the mud. She was staring at the wreckage with a look of such profound, hollow despair that it struck Silas harder than any scream or sob could have. In that moment, the careful pretense of distance he had tried to maintain between them fell away, shattered like her broken plants. He dismounted and walked over to her, his long shadow falling across the ruined earth. For a long moment, he said nothing. There were no words of comfort that would not sound hollow and foolish in the face of such calculated hatred. So instead of speaking, he knelt beside her in the dirt. Silently, he began to clear away the debris, pulling up the broken stalks and smoothing the soil with his bare hands. Alara watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, after a slight hesitation, she joined him. They worked together in a shared, somber rhythm, their movements synchronized by a mutual grief. They did not speak. The silence was filled with a meaning that words could not have carried. As they both reached for the same broken vine, the backs of their hands brushed. The brief contact was like a spark of lightning. a powerful current of unspoken emotion passing between them. In that shared, silent work, a new level of intimacy was forged, deeper and more real than any conversation. He had not just witnessed her pain, he had chosen to share in the thankless, heartbreaking task of cleaning up its aftermath. That shared moment opened a door between them. They started to meet. Away from the prying, hateful eyes of the town, they found a secluded spot by a small, cottonwood-lined creek, a place where the only sounds were the whisper of the wind in the leaves and the gentle murmur of the water. In the dappled sunlight, surrounded by the quiet peace of nature, they began to truly talk. Their conversations were hesitant at first. He was a man unaccustomed to speaking of himself, and she was a woman unaccustomed to being truly listened to. He spoke of the things he knew, the rhythm of ranch work, the silent language of horses, the signs in the sky that foretold a change in the weather. She, in turn, spoke of the plants she grew, of the stories her mother had told her of a world where the earth was respected, not just owned. She spoke of the strange, lonely feeling of being caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. One evening, as dusk settled over the land, painting the sky in soft shades of purple and orange, Silas shared a piece of his own tragedy. He did not give her the whole story, not yet, but he told her that he had once had a small ranch of his own, a family. He spoke of the silence that came after he lost them, a silence so total and profound it felt like the end of the world itself. His confession was brief and stark, delivered in a low, rough voice, but it was an offering of his deepest, most guarded wound. Ilara listened, her heart aching with a fierce empathy. In his quiet, painful admission of loss, she finally understood the true source of his protective nature and the deep well of sadness that lived behind his calm eyes. She did not offer empty platitudes or words of pity. She simply reached out and rested her hand on his forearm. It was a simple gesture, but it was one of profound understanding and acceptance. His pain was real to her, and her quiet, steady presence was a balm to a wound he thought would never stop bleeding. But the Kales were not idle. Jed, still smarting from his public humiliations and enraged by the whispers he now heard about Silas and Ilara meeting by the creek, decided to take matters into his own hands. He gathered two of his most loyal cronies and laid a crude ambush for Silas one night on the dark trail that led back to the Henderson ranch. Silas, however, was a man whose life had taught him to be constantly aware of his surroundings, to listen to the silences as much as the sounds. As he rode through a narrow, rock-strewn section of the trail, he sensed that something was wrong. The chirping of the crickets had fallen unnaturally silent. He caught a flicker of movement in the brush that was not caused by the wind. He reined in his horse, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol, his body tensing. The attack, when it came, was clumsy and predictable, but the confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. It was not a gunfight in the open street. Silas used the darkness and his intimate knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. He slipped from his horse and became a shadow among the rocks. He disarmed and disabled Jed's men with a series of fierce, efficient movements, his body a blur of controlled violence. He moved not with anger, but with a cold, deadly purpose. He left Jed for last. He caught the deputy with a hard right hook that broke his nose with a sickening crunch. As Jed lay wheezing in the dust, Silas leaned over him, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. "This is your only warning," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Stay away from her." He left them there, bruised and broken, and rode back to the ranch. The event proved something to Sheriff Brody Cale. Silas Blackwood was not just a stubborn drifter who refused to be intimidated. He was a dangerous and highly skilled opponent. The time for veiled threats and petty harassment was over. Brody now understood that to get what he wanted, the valley, Ilara's land, and absolute control, he would have to eliminate Silas Blackwood completely. For weeks, the sky over Redemption Creek had been a vast, unchanging bowl of placid blue, so pale and baked by the sun it seemed almost white at the edges, But then, a change began. It started subtly, a darkening on the western horizon that at first looked like nothing more than a distant plume of smoke. But the darkness grew, spreading across the sky like a bruise. The air, once dry and hot, became heavy and thick, charged with a strange, electric stillness, a low, ominous rumble, more felt in the bones than heard with the ears, began to echo across the plains. A massive summer thunderstorm was gathering its strength, preparing to unleash its fury on the parched land. Silas had ridden out from the Henderson ranch that afternoon, a heavy sack of supplies tied behind his saddle. Abel Henderson had sent him into town for provisions, and Silas had used his own wages to buy flour, coffee, and sugar, the very things he knew Alara had been denied. It was a small gesture, one he could make without drawing undue attention, but it felt necessary. He was approaching her small cabin, the dark clouds boiling overhead. When the storm finally broke, it did not begin with a gentle patter. The sky simply opened up, and the rain came down with sudden, shocking violence. It fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that blurred the world into a churning gray chaos. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at the sagebrush and bending the lone cottonwoods near her cabin nearly to the ground. The dry creek bed he had crossed only moments before, a dusty scar on the land, became a raging, muddy torrent within minutes, the water rising with terrifying speed. The path back to the ranch was gone, swallowed by the flash flood. He spurred his horse the last few yards to the cabin, leaping from the saddle as Alara threw open the door, her face pale with alarm. He shoved the sodden sack of supplies inside and pulled his horse into the meager shelter of a small lean-to just as the full, unrestrained power of the storm descended. He was trapped. He had no choice but to take shelter with her. He stepped inside, pulling the heavy plank door shut against the screaming wind. The world outside vanished, replaced by the small, confined space of the one-room cabin. The room felt intensely intimate, charged with a palpable tension that had nothing to do with the storm. Outside was a chaotic symphony of cracking thunder and shrieking wind. Inside, the only sounds were the relentless, drumming tattoo of rain on the sod roof and the soft, comforting hiss of the fire in the stone hearth. The storm seemed to magnify their awareness of each other, shrinking the world until it contained only the two of them. Every small movement, every shared glance, was amplified in the confined space. Silas stood near the door, rainwater dripping from his hat and duster to form a dark puddle on the clean-swept floorboards. He felt impossibly large, clumsy, and out of place in her small, meticulously kept home. He took off his hat, turning it over and over in his hands, his usual stillness replaced by a restless uncertainty. Alara moved about the cabin with a deft, quiet grace, though he could see the rigid tension in her shoulders. She lit another lantern, its warm, yellow glow pushing back against the stormy twilight that pressed in at the single small window. She took his wet duster and hung it on a peg near the fire, her fingers brushing his arm as she did, a touch as fleeting and electric as the lightning that intermittently lit up the sky. The situation was a paradox, a sanctuary from the storm's fury, and a crucible for the unspoken feelings that simmered between them. To break the heavy, charged silence, Alara turned to the simple tasks of preparing a meal. She moved with a practiced economy, her hands sure and steady as she stirred a small pot hanging over the fire. The savory scent of rabbit stew, made from the game he had left for her days before, began to fill the small space. A warm, comforting aroma that stood in defiance of the chaos outside. She took a small loaf of bread, baked that morning from a wooden box, and sliced it onto 2 tin plates. They ate, sitting across from each other at her small, hand-hewn table. The flickering lantern light softened the hard lines on their faces, casting their small table in an island of warm light surrounded by storm-tossed darkness. They began to talk, their voices low, as if not to be swallowed by the roar of the wind and rain. The conversation was different from their stolen talks by the creek. here, trapped together by the storm's power. The walls they kept around themselves began to dissolve. The talk was deeper, more personal, hesitantly, her eyes on the plate in front of her. She asked him about the ranch he had lost. It was a question that hung in the air between them, a direct and gentle probing of the great, silent wound he carried. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flickering flame of the lantern. The words came slowly at first, rough and stiff from disuse, like stones being pulled from long-abandoned ground. But then they began to flow, with a raw, painful honesty that he had not shared with another living soul. He described the small house he had built with his own 2 hands, the way the cottonwood planks had smelled in the sun. He spoke of the way the morning light would come over the eastern hills, flooding their small valley with gold. He spoke not just of his wife, but of the sound of her laughter, a sound he could still hear in his quietest moments, a sweet, painful ghost of a melody. He did not just describe the fire that had taken them from him. He described the emptiness that had followed, the hollowing out of his entire world, until all that was left was a vast, echoing silence. He spoke of coming home to find nothing but blackened timber and the smell of ash, a silence so total and absolute that it felt like the world itself had ended. As he spoke, he was not just recounting a memory. He was living it again, the pain as fresh and sharp as it had been on that terrible day. Ilara listened with an intensity that was a form of embrace. She did not interrupt, did not offer hollow words of comfort. She simply listened, her dark eyes filled with a deep, compassionate sorrow. She saw the immense pain he carried, the crushing weight of a survivor's guilt. She saw the man beneath the haunted drifter, the man who had loved and built and dreamed, only to have it all turn to smoke. In the wake of his confession, the space was filled with a new, more profound silence, and into that space, she offered a piece of her own wounded soul. She spoke of her own deep-seated fears, not just the immediate, sharp fear of the Kales, but the dull, constant ache of a future she saw stretching before her, a future of unrelenting loneliness. She confessed her dream, a thing she had barely dared to admit even to herself, a dream of one day leaving Redemption Creek, of finding a place where the story of her birth did not define her worth, a place where she would not be judged for the color of her skin or the shape of her eyes, a place where she could simply be. Their shared confession stripped away the last of their defenses. They sat in the flickering lantern light, no longer just a guarded man and a resilient woman. They were 2 lonely, wounded souls who had looked into the other's eyes and recognized their own pain, their own solitude. Just then, the storm reached its terrifying crescendo. A deafening crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, shaking the very foundations of the small cabin. It was followed almost instantly by the violent, tearing sound of a massive cottonwood tree splitting nearby, a sound like a rifle shot magnified 100 times. The wind shrieked, a high, demonic keen, and the sod roof began to groan under the strain. A leak sprang near the far wall, a thin, steady trickle of water that quickly became a drip, then a steady stream. Another leak started near the door. The raw, elemental power raging outside brought the fear and tension inside to a head. It was in this moment of primal terror that Ilara's carefully constructed composure, the armor she had worn for a lifetime, finally shattered. The weight of it all, the town's grinding hatred, the vicious destruction of her garden, the constant, looming threat of the Kales, and now this terrifying, violent storm, all of it converged into a single, unbearable point of pressure. A single tear escaped from the corner of her eye, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. It was followed by another, and another. Soon, her shoulders were shaking with deep, silent sobs that she desperately tried to stifle. Her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. Silas moved from his chair to her side, his heart aching with a tenderness that was almost painful. He knelt beside her and watched her cry for a moment, and in her tears he saw not weakness, but the immense, Unimaginable strength it must have taken to hold it all in for so long. She looked up at him then, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a desperate, raw plea that went far beyond the fear of the storm. "I do not want to be alone tonight," she gasped, the words torn from the deepest, most hidden part of her. It was not a request for a single night's comfort. It was a confession of a loneliness that ran deeper than the events of the past few weeks. It was the loneliness of a lifetime. It was the most vulnerable he had ever seen her, and in that vulnerability, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. He reached for her, his movements sure and certain. He pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, burying her face against his chest as she wept. He held her tightly, his large hand stroking her hair, his body a solid, unmoving anchor in the chaos of the storm. It was not an act of pity, not the strong saving the weak. It was an act of profound connection. He was not saving a damsel in distress. He was holding an equal, a fellow survivor. He whispered words of comfort against her hair, not empty platitudes, but simple, solid truths. "You are not alone," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "I am here." In his arms, she was not the town's outcast. She was just Ilara, and he was not the haunted drifter. He was just Silas. He had saved her from her endless tears, not by stopping them, but by giving her a safe, unshakable place to finally let them fall. Her sobs slowly subsided, replaced by a quiet, shuddering peace. She remained in his embrace, her body molded against his. After a long time, she tilted her head back to look up at him, her face tear-streaked and illuminated by the warm, flickering firelight. The air between them was thick with an energy that was at once exquisitely tender and fiercely passionate. The desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks, hidden beneath layers of caution and pain, now burned brightly in the space between them. He lowered his head, and their first kiss was not a gentle, hesitant exploration. It was a desperate, profound meeting of souls. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and rain and shared desperation. A kiss that spoke of past pain and the defiant, blossoming hope of a shared future. It was a fierce affirmation of life in the midst of a world that had tried, and failed, to crush them both. The storm eventually raged itself out, as the first pale gray light of dawn began to filter through the cabin's small window. The world outside was transformed. The violent rain had washed the dust from the air, and every leaf, every blade of grass, looked clean and new and impossibly fragile. A profound silence had fallen over the land. They lay together, wrapped in blankets by the dying embers of the fire. Nothing was the same. The night of the storm had irrevocably altered the landscape of their lives. In the heart of the tempest, they had found a rare and beautiful love, a glimmer of profound hope in the darkness. But as they looked out at the washed-out, broken world, they both understood, without needing to say the words, that this love had not solved their problems. It had made them stronger, but it had also made them a much bigger, brighter target for the darkness that still waited for them in Redemption Creek. In the days following the storm, the world returned to its harsh, sun-baked normal. To any watching eye, nothing had changed, but between Silas and Ilara, a new world had been born. In their stolen moments together in the quiet sanctuary of the Cottonwood Creek, a tangible shift had occurred. A new, quiet intimacy flowed between them, as natural and steady as the water that slipped over the smooth stones at their feet. Their conversations were softer now, their voices holding a different timbre. Their touches, once hesitant and accidental, were now frequent and lingering. A simple gesture, like him reaching out to tuck a stray strand of wind-blown hair behind her ear, or her hand coming to rest on his arm as they spoke, carried the entire weight of their shared night, of the confessions whispered against the storm's roar. This newfound love was a source of immense, unfamiliar strength for them both. For Silas, It was like a gentle spring rain falling on the parched, fire-blackened landscape of his soul, beginning to fill the hollow spaces he thought would be empty forever. For Ilara, who had known only the sharp edges of the world's judgment, his affection was a validation she had never known, a quiet, powerful sense of belonging that was both thrilling and terrifying. But their happiness was a fragile, secret thing, a delicate wildflower blooming in the shadow of a rock slide. They knew it was a treasure that had to be hidden, for the threat of discovery was constant. At the Henderson Ranch, Abel Henderson saw the change in Silas. The old rancher missed very little. He noted the way Silas's gaze would often drift toward the distant plume of smoke from Ilara's cabin. He saw the subtle softening of the hard, sorrowful lines around the younger man's eyes. He said nothing, his face remaining a non-committal mask of weathered wrinkles. But his own eyes held a deep and troubled concern. He had lived in this valley long enough to know that in a town like Redemption Creek, a love like the one he saw growing between his quiet new hand and the outcast woman was not a treasure to be celebrated, but a crime to be punished. Sheriff Brody Cale's rage had been simmering, a venomous brew left to fester in the dark. He heard the whispers that snaked through the town, rumors fueled by the sight of Silas Blackwood's horse tied outside Ilara Vance's cabin the morning after the storm. The public humiliation of his brother Jed, coupled with Silas's continued, quiet defiance, had pushed Brody far past the point of simple intimidation. He saw their growing bond not as a romance, but as a direct conspiracy against his authority, a unified front of rebellion, his long-held desire for Ilara's land, with its valuable and unspoken water rights, now merged with a personal, venomous need to utterly destroy the man who had claimed her affection. He began to formulate a more sophisticated and damning plan. A simple bushwhacking was too crude, too obvious. He needed to not just remove Silas, but to turn the entire town against him. He would use their own fear and prejudice as his weapon, forging them into a tool to do his bidding. He needed to utterly discredit Silas Blackwood, to methodically transform him from a quiet stranger into a monster in the eyes of the community. The opportunity he was looking for arose with a neighboring rancher named Frank Peters. Peters was a stubborn, cantankerous old man who had been in a long-running, bitter dispute with Brody Cale over a strip of land that bordered the Sweetwater River. Peters had a deep, abiding hatred for the sheriff and had repeatedly and profanely refused to sell the parcel, thwarting Brody's quiet ambitions to control the majority of the valley's precious water. One cool morning, a farmhand found Frank Peters dead in his own barn. He was lying face down in the hay, a single, dark hole in his back. The ranch was in disarray, and several of his prize horses were missing from the corral. The scene was carefully staged to look like a robbery gone tragically wrong. Panic and a cold. Metallic fear spread through the community like a contagion. This was the moment Brody Cale had been waiting for. With the practiced efficiency of a master manipulator, Sheriff Cale began to skillfully direct the town's fear and anger toward the perfect scapegoat, Silas Blackwood, the dangerous, silent drifter with a mysterious past and a known willingness to resort to violence. He did not make a public proclamation. Instead, he subtly planted the seeds of suspicion, letting them take root in the fertile soil of the town's distrust. He had a quiet word with Gable at the general store, his voice filled with feigned concern. He spoke with the blacksmith while having a new shoe fitted on his horse. He let his words drift among the men drinking at the saloon. "A man with no history is a man with something to hide," he would say, shaking his head sadly. "It is a terrible thing when violence is brought into our valley by an outsider." The townspeople, already primed to distrust Silas, readily absorbed the poison. The narrative took hold. The drifter was a killer. Next, Brody manufactured the evidence. He dispatched one of his deputies, a man named Harker whose loyalty was to Brody's coin and not to the law, on a secret errand. Harker crept up to Ilara's cabin in the dead of night. On a previous visit, Silas had used his distinctive skinning knife, with its hand-carved antler handle, to repair a broken strap on Ilara's saddle. In a moment of distraction, he had left it behind on her porch. Harker stole the knife. The following day, it was discovered by a posse, half buried in the mud near the entrance to Frank Peters' barn. Then, a few of the stolen horses were found grazing placidly in a remote box canyon on the far eastern edge of Henderson's property. It was miles from the main ranch house and bunkhouse, a place a clever thief might stash his loot, but it was close enough to implicate someone who worked for Abel Henderson. The evidence was circumstantial, flimsy as a spider's web, but in the court of public opinion, it was as solid as iron. The knife, the horses, Silas's history of confronting the Cales, it all painted a clear and damning picture. The tipping point was reached. That evening, fueled by righteous anger and an afternoon of cheap whiskey at the saloon, a mob formed. It was not a lynch mob yet, but it was close, a single spark away from becoming one, led by a vengeful Jed Cale, his still-healing nose a grotesque reminder of his hatred. They rode out toward the Henderson ranch as the sun bled away behind the mountains. They carried flickering torches that threw long, dancing shadows, and their rifles were held at the ready. Their collective voice was a low, angry growl that rolled across the plains. Abel Henderson met them at the main gate to his property. He stood alone, a double-barreled shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. He was one old man against a tide of manufactured hysteria. "Now hold on," he said, his voice a calm, steady rasp against their angry muttering. "Let us not lose our heads. There is a law in this town." "We are the law tonight, old man," someone shouted from the back. Jed Cale spurred his horse forward. "We want Blackwood. Give him to us, or we will burn you out." Silas watched from the dark interior of the bunkhouse, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt. He understood the situation instantly. He could fight. He could probably kill several of them before they inevitably brought him down. But as he looked past the angry, torch-lit faces of the mob, he saw the deep fear and weary resignation in Abel Henderson's eyes. A fight here would mean the old man's death, a man who had shown him nothing but fairness. It would be a bloodbath, engulfing the one place that had offered him a sliver of peace. Believing, perhaps naively, that the formal justice system, however flawed, was a better fate than what this mob had in store for him. He made a decision. He took a deep breath, unbuckled his gun belt, and laid it on his bunk. He walked out of the bunkhouse, his hands empty and open at his sides. Just then, Sheriff Brody Cale rode up, arriving as if on cue to calm the situation he had so expertly created. He held up a hand, feigning authority. "That is enough. There will be no mob justice in my town." Silas walked through the parted ranks of the stunned riders until he stood before the sheriff. His voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "I will go with you, Sheriff," he said, his eyes locking onto Brody's. "But I want your word that Mr. Henderson and his property will be left alone." Brody Cale looked down from his horse, a smug, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "You have my word, Mr. Blackwood," he said. "You have my word." Elara heard the news from a passing homesteader's wife, a woman who had never spoken to her before but now delivered the information with a kind of grim satisfaction. Her world collapsed. It felt as if the storm had returned, but this time it was raging inside her own heart, a tempest of terror and disbelief. Later that day, Deputy Harker came for her. He did not arrest her, but requested her presence at the sheriff's office for questioning. The walk through town was an agony. Every window seemed to hold accusing eyes. Every whisper on the wind felt like a condemnation. The interrogation was a brutal exercise in psychological warfare. Sheriff Cale did not lay a hand on her. He did not even raise his voice. He sat behind his desk, polished and calm, and his words were like carefully aimed blows. He preyed on her deepest insecurities, on her mixed heritage, on her profound isolation. He insinuated that she was Silas's accomplice, that her unnatural affections for a man like him were proof of their shared guilt. "He is a killer, Ilara," Brody said, his voice a soft, sympathetic poison. "He came here and brought death with him. But you can still save yourself." He leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "I can protect you. All you have to do is tell the truth. Testify that he confessed to you. Tell the court what he told you in the dead of night, in your cabin. Do that, and I will see to it that you are protected." She understood what his protection meant. It was the same protection a wolf offered a lamb, despite the terror that was making her heart hammer against her ribs. She found a core of steel within her. She thought of Silas's quiet strength, of the feel of his hand in hers, of the love that had bloomed so fiercely between them. She lifted her chin and looked Brody Cale directly in the eye. "He did not do it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "And I will not lie for you." Her defiance was a mistake. It sealed her fate in Brody's eyes. He had offered her a way out, and she had refused it. She was no longer a pawn to be manipulated. She was a loose end, a threat to his perfect plan, and loose ends needed to be tied up. Silas was thrown into the town's jail, a squalid, dark cell that smelled of damp earth and human misery. A thin, lumpy mattress lay on a rickety cot, and a single, small window high on the wall was crisscrossed with thick iron bars. Through that window, he could see a sliver of the bleached sky, and against it, the stark, skeletal frame of the town gallows. He realized the full, horrifying extent of the trap. The circuit judge was not due to pass through Redemption Creek for another month. Brody Cale had no intention of waiting that long. He could hear the talk from the guards outside his cell, the whispers of the townsfolk who gathered to stare at the jailhouse. Cale was stoking the fires, feeding their fear and anger, suggesting that the good people of Redemption Creek might not have the patience to wait for a formal trial, that some forms of justice needed to be swift and decisive. The glimmer of hope that had ignited in Ilara's cabin, the fragile warmth of a future he had dared to imagine, was gone. It was replaced by the cold, hard certainty of his own mortality. He was trapped. The town wanted him dead. And the woman he loved, the woman who had finally quieted the ghosts of his past, was alone and at the absolute mercy of the man who had framed him. For Ilara, the world had shrunk to the four walls of her cabin, and even that small space felt vast and threatening. She was adrift in a sea of terror and despair, the entire town an inescapable prison. Every face she glimpsed through her window was hostile. Every passing whisper on the wind felt like a judgment meant for her ears. The love that had been her anchor, the source of a strength she was just beginning to discover, now felt like a terrible, crushing liability. It was the reason Silas was sitting in a jail cell, the reason his life was measured in the hours until the town's manufactured rage boiled over. For a full day and a night, she succumbed to a paralyzing fear. She barricaded her door and huddled in the darkness, jumping at every sound, the scuttling of a mouse in the walls, the sigh of the wind in the chimney. She was convinced that the Cales would come for her next, that they would break down her door to silence the last person who could speak to Silas's innocence. This was her darkest hour, a black pit of despair where the endless tears Silas had once saved her from threatened to return and drown her completely. She sat by her cold hearth, wrapped in a blanket, and felt the loneliness of a lifetime gathering around her like a shroud. But as she stared into the gray ashes of the fireplace, a memory surfaced, a spark in the darkness. She remembered the feeling of his hand in hers, the rough, calloused strength of it. She remembered the look in his eyes in the flickering lamplight of the cabin, an unwavering belief in her that she had never seen in another soul. She recalled his quiet, unshakable courage in the face of Jed Cale's taunts, in the face of Brody Cale's threats. She realized then that succumbing to this fear, letting it break her, was a betrayal. It was a betrayal of him, and it was a betrayal of the fierce, beautiful thing that had grown between them. A new, hot, and unfamiliar emotion began to burn through the cold fog of her grief. It was resolve, a fierce, sharp-edged resolve. If the town would not provide justice, she would have to find it herself. She knew she could not match the Cales with force. She had no gun, no posse, no power. Her only weapons were her mind, which her father had taught her to sharpen, and her intimate knowledge of the land, which her mother had passed down to her. She forced herself to think logically, to push the panic away and see the situation with cold clarity. What was Brody Cale's real motive? It could not just be a personal hatred for Silas. A man like Brody did not orchestrate a murder and risk everything for simple animosity. It had to be bigger. Her mind went back to the one thing of true and lasting value in this harsh, unforgiving country: the land and the water that gave it life. That night, she began to move. Under the cover of a moonless sky, she became a ghost, a shadow flitting through a landscape she knew as well as her own reflection. She began her investigation not at the scene of the crime, which she knew would be too well watched, but by observing. She found a hidden spot in the scrubland behind the saloon, close enough to hear the low murmur of conversations from the men drinking on the porch. She watched the sheriff's office from a darkened alleyway across the street, noting who came and went, the patterns of the deputies' movements. She was piecing together a puzzle, gathering the scattered, seemingly insignificant pieces of the truth. Meanwhile, Silas was not idly waiting for his fate. In the suffocating, stale-aired confines of his cell, his mind, freed from the distractions of the outside world, was sharp and brutally focused. He was a man who observed everything, a habit born of a lifetime spent reading the subtle signs of the weather and the moods of animals. Now, he applied that same intense scrutiny to his prison. He watched the guard, a paunchy, lazy man named Clyde, and noted his routine, the way he would take a long pull from a hidden flask every hour, the way his attention wandered, the way he would doze in his chair in the dead of night. Silas studied the cell itself, not as a cage, but as a mechanism with weaknesses. He saw the rust eating away at the hinges of the small window. He examined the old, heavy lock on his cell door, noting the years of accumulated grime and dust packed into its works. He was a man accustomed to solving problems with the resources at hand, and his own life was the problem he now had to solve. His escape was not a desperate, frantic hope. It was a plan he was meticulously constructing, piece by painstaking piece, from the thin, rough blanket on his cot. He worked a single, tough thread loose, using his thumbnail to flatten and stiffen the end. He began the patient, mind-numbing work of picking at the grime inside the lock mechanism, a tiny bit at a time, clearing a path for a future opportunity. A crucial breakthrough in Alara's investigation came from an unexpected source. Abel Henderson, consumed by a heavy guilt over Silas's arrest and knowing with an old man's certainty that Silas was no killer, approached her secretly. He found her one evening as she gathered herbs near the creek, his sudden appearance from the cottonwoods startling her. His face was a mask of grim determination. He told her he trusted her, and that he had to tell her something. He spoke of a piece of town gossip he had dismissed weeks ago as nothing more than idle talk. Frank Peters, he said, had been boasting in the saloon that he had finally figured out why the small creek running through his disputed land never ran dry. Even in the hottest summers, he had discovered it was fed by a much larger underground spring, a hidden source of water that could sustain a herd through the worst of droughts. Alara's breath caught in her throat. In a land where water was more valuable than gold, a discovery like that was a death sentence for a man like Frank Peters. Whoever controlled that land and that spring controlled the future of every ranch downstream. Then Henderson delivered the final, damning piece of the puzzle. Brody Cale, through a series of quiet, proxy purchases over the last year, had been buying up that very downstream land. Suddenly, the motive was crystal clear, as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. This was not about a few stolen horses. This was about a land and water grab of immense value, a plan for an empire built on a single, secret spring. Armed with this knowledge, Alara became bolder, her fear replaced by a cold, driving purpose. She knew she needed more than a motive. She needed physical proof, something tangible that would connect Brody Cale directly to the crime. One night, cloaked in darkness, she made her way to the Peters Ranch. The area around the barn where the body was found had been trampled into a muddy mess by the sheriff's posse. But she did not search there. She searched the periphery, the places they would have overlooked, the places a man might stand while he waited. Her knowledge of the terrain, taught to her by her mother, allowed her to see things others would miss. She knew how the wind would drift things, how a small object could get caught in the tangled roots of the sagebrush. And there, tucked deep under the roots of a large, gnarled bush, she found it, a half-smoked cheroot. It was from a specific, expensive brand, one with a sweetened tip that she had seen Brody Cale smoke countless times, a smell that was inextricably linked to his presence. It was not definitive proof, not a confession, but it placed him at the scene of the crime. Her heart pounding against her ribs, she carefully wrapped the cheroot in her handkerchief and slipped away into the night. The atmosphere in town, however, had grown uglier. Talk of a lynching was no longer a whispered suggestion, but an open and drunken debate in the saloon. Brody Cale did nothing to quell it, instead feeding the flames with talk of the people's right to swift justice. Henderson, hearing the rising tide of anger, knew that time was running out. He decided he had to create a diversion, a chance for Silas to act. That night, he rode to the far side of town and, with a heavy heart, set a massive haystack, part of his own precious winter stores, on fire. The flames leaped into the night sky, a brilliant orange blossom of destruction that could be seen for miles. Shouts of fire erupted through Redemption Creek. The drunken mob poured out of the saloon, their talk of lynching forgotten in the face of a more immediate and tangible threat. They, along with most of the town's other able-bodied men, rushed toward the blaze. This was the moment Silas had been waiting for. The main guard, Clyde, had run with the rest of them, leaving a single, half-drunk junior deputy to watch the jail. Using a thin piece of wire he had worked loose from the frame of his cot, Silas probed the lock he had so painstakingly cleaned. The tumblers, freed from years of grime, clicked into place. The lock sprang open. He moved with a silent, deadly speed, overpowering the shocked deputy before he could even cry out and taking his gun. He slipped out the back door of the jailhouse and melted into the shadows. His first instinct was not to flee, not to save his own skin. It was to find Alara. He knew, with a chilling and absolute certainty, that with him escaped, Brody Cale would see her as his last remaining threat, a threat he would move to eliminate immediately. He arrived at her cabin, his lungs burning, just as his worst fears were realized. Jed Cale and the Deputy Harker were kicking at her door, the wood groaning under the force of their blows. Brody had sent them to silence her for good. Silas did not hesitate. He did not call out a warning. He burst into the cabin directly behind them. The fight was a primal, desperate explosion of violence in the small, enclosed space. A lamp was knocked from the table in the chaos, plunging the room into a frantic, terrifying dance of shadows and firelight. Silas fought not just for his own life, but for hers, a ferocity that Jed and his crony were completely unprepared for. He moved with a cold, deadly precision, honed by a lifetime of survival, breaking Jed's arm with a sickening crack and disabling Harker with a blow that sent him crashing to the floor. In the aftermath, breathing heavily in the wrecked and firelit room, they stared at each other. Alara, terrified but unharmed, rushed to him. In her trembling hand, she held out her handkerchief and unfolded it, revealing the half-smoked cheroot. He looked from the small, crucial piece of evidence in her hand to the two unconscious men groaning on the floor. In that instant, everything came together. They had the motive, they had the physical proof, and they had the prisoners who could be made to confess. But just then, they heard it. The distant but clear sound of the alarm bell being rung at the jail. The entire town, led by a furious and now desperate Sheriff Cale, would be hunting them, They were fugitives. They were lovers. And they were the sole bearers of a truth that could get them killed, completely and utterly alone against the world that Brody Cale had built. There was no time for thought, only for action. The sharp clang of the alarm bell from the town was a death knell, and they were its intended victims. Silas grabbed the coil of rope from Jed's saddle, quickly and efficiently binding the two groaning men, gagging them with strips torn from a horse blanket. He hauled them onto their own horses, slumping them over the saddles like sacks of grain. It was a grim necessity, a part of the desperate plan that was already forming in the sharp, clear spaces of his mind. He helped Ilara mount her horse, then swung onto his own. Together, they fled, not towards the open plains where a posse could easily track them, but into the harsh, broken wilderness that bordered the valley, a landscape that Silas knew as well as the lines on his own hand. The flight was a grueling test of their endurance and their trust in one another. The terrain was their only ally, a treacherous maze of steep-walled canyons, rocky outcrops that could tear a horseshoe from a hoof, and dense pine forests where the sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Silas led them with an instinct born of years of solitary travel, his eyes constantly scanning for tracks, for shelter, for the telltale glint of a rifle barrel in the sun. He pushed them onward, knowing that every mile they covered bought them another hour of life. Ilara, who had spent her life surviving in a different kind of wilderness, proved her own resilience. While Silas navigated their path, she found them sustenance. Her knowledge of the land was deep and intuitive. She pointed out the patches of wild onion and the roots of the sago lily that could be dug up and roasted. She found a trickle of clean water seeping from a rock face and knew which leaves to crush into a poultice for a cut on Silas's arm. They moved as one, their skills complementing each other perfectly. In the quiet, stolen moments, huddled by a tiny, smokeless fire in a hidden cave high on a canyon wall, their bond deepened into something unbreakable. The passion born in the storm was now tempered by the hard realities of survival, forged into a partnership of equals. They were no longer just lovers, drawn together by a shared loneliness. They were soldiers in a war for their own lives, and for the simple, unadorned truth. As they shared a meager meal of roasted roots, their eyes would meet over the small fire, and in that shared glance was a complete and total understanding that words could never capture. After 2 days of running, they found a secure, well-hidden shelter in a deep, narrow canyon with only one way in or out. They were safe, for the moment. The posse, they knew, would not risk entering such a perfect place for an ambush. Here, with the luxury of time, they faced a choice. They could disappear. They could keep riding north, into the territories, find a place where the names Blackwood and Vance meant nothing, and start a new life under new names. The thought was a tempting siren call, a whisper of peace and anonymity after a lifetime of struggle. But as they sat together, watching the sliver of sky visible from their canyon floor turn from blue to purple, they both knew it was a choice they could not make. A life built on the foundation of running away would be no life at all. The injustice would fester inside them like a poison. Silas's name would forever be branded as a murderer's, a stain that would follow them even into the deepest wilderness. More importantly, leaving would mean letting Brody Cale win. It would mean allowing his evil to take root and flourish in Redemption Creek, a cancer left to grow unchecked, for Silas, whose life had been irrevocably shaped by a failure to protect his family. The thought of failing again, of walking away from this fight, was unbearable. And for Ilara, who had endured a lifetime of injustice with quiet, stoic pride, the idea of turning her back and letting the lies stand was a violation of her very soul. They would not run. They decided they must return and confront Cale, not for revenge, but for a justice that was as clean and hard as the rock that surrounded them, whatever the cost. Their plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They could not fight the whole town, so they had to win the town over. They needed a public stage, a place where the truth could be revealed in a way that was so stark and undeniable that even the most prejudiced mind could not turn away from it, leaving Alara to guard their prisoners. Silas risked a clandestine journey back to the Henderson ranch under the cover of darkness. He found the old rancher in his barn, the worry of the past few days having etched even deeper lines into his face. Silas explained the situation quickly, laying out the truth of the water rights, the evidence of the cheroot, and the confession he was sure he could get from Harker. He gave the old rancher a set of instructions. Henderson's face was grim, but his eyes shone with a firm resolve. He agreed to play his part. He was to go into town and spread the word. Silas Blackwood was tired of running. He wanted to surrender, but he would only do so in a public place, in front of the entire town. To prevent a misunderstanding, it was Henderson who suggested the town's unfinished church, a neutral space, a house of God not yet claimed by any of the town's factions, a place that was symbolically, if not practically, sacred ground. The climax unfolded the following afternoon. The entire town of Redemption Creek gathered in the half-built church. The building had a roof and walls, but the windows were empty frames and the floor was bare, packed earth. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of anticipation and menace. Sheriff Brody Cale stood at the front, near the simple wooden pulpit, the very picture of calm, righteous authority. He expected to finally capture his prey, to see this whole affair brought to a neat and tidy conclusion. At the appointed time, the heavy main doors swung open. Silas and Alara walked in. Side by side, they were unarmed, their hands held open and visible at their sides. A collective gasp, a single, sharp intake of breath, ran through the crowded room. "Seize them!" Brody Cale commanded, his voice booming with authority. Two deputies started to move forward, their hands on their pistols. But Silas's voice, calm and powerful, rang through the building, stopping them in their tracks. "Before you do," he said, his eyes locked on Brody, a gaze of pure, unadulterated steel. "The people of this town deserve to hear the truth about Frank Peters." Silas laid out the motive, his words simple, direct, and stripped of any emotion. He spoke of the underground spring, of the immense value of Frank Peters's land, and of Brody Cale's secret, methodical purchases of the downstream properties. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man telling a truth he was willing to die for. As he spoke, the crowd began to murmur. Abel Henderson, true to his word, had spent the morning quietly corroborating the facts of the land purchases with a few of the more respected town elders. The first tiny seeds of doubt had been planted. Brody scoffed, a loud, dismissive sound. "These are the desperate lies of a cornered murderer. Do you people honestly intend to listen to this?" Then, Alara stepped forward. In the hostile silence, she held up the small, half-smoked cheroot. Her voice, though not loud, carried to every corner of the church, clear and steady. "This was found near Frank Peters's barn on the night he was killed," she said. Then she looked out, not at Brody, but at the faces in the crowd. "I ask all of you, how many of you have seen the sheriff smoke this exact brand, with its sweetened tip, every single day?" More murmurs rippled through the crowd, louder this time. Men and women exchanged glances, nodding in slow, dawning recognition. The sheriff's expensive cheroots were as much a part of his public image as his polished boots and his silver star. Brody's composure began to crack. A dark, ugly flush rose up his neck. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara, his voice losing its smooth control and becoming a vicious snarl. "She is a liar, a worthless half-breed whore, in league with a killer." His venomous prejudice, the ugly truth that had always lurked just beneath his civilized veneer, was now laid bare for all to see. But Silas had one final card to play. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Abel Henderson, who was standing near a side door. The old rancher pulled the door open. Two figures were shoved into the room, Jed Cale and the deputy Harker, bound but now ungagged, their faces bruised and pale with terror. Under the weight of 100 pairs of accusing eyes, and with Silas's cold, silent promise of what would happen to him if he lied. Harker broke. The deputy's nerves shattered completely. In a choked, terrified voice, he confessed the entire conspiracy, from the planting of the knife and the horses, to Brody's direct order to go to Alara's cabin and silence her for good. The truth exploded into the room, a blinding flash of light that shattered Brody Cale's intricate web of lies. Exposed, cornered, and his authority evaporated in an instant. Brody Cale did not surrender. He was a predator, and predators do not capitulate. With a final, desperate roar of pure rage, he drew his pistol. The church erupted into chaos. Silas reacted instantly, shoving Alara hard to the ground and shielding her with his own body. A gunshot echoed like a thunderclap off the unfinished walls. Then another and another. In the frantic, terrifying exchange of fire between the cornered sheriff and some of the now enraged townsmen who had come armed, Brody Cale was struck. He staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before collapsing to the dirt floor, a victim of the very violence he had so masterfully cultivated. Justice had been served, but it was ugly, bloody, and utterly devoid of triumph. A stunned, heavy silence descended upon the church, broken only by the ragged breathing of the living and the settling of the dust. The people of Redemption Creek looked from Cale's body on the floor to the couple who had brought the truth to light, and then, finally, to each other. In that moment, they were forced to confront the ugliness of their own prejudice, the terrifying ease with which they had been manipulated, their fear and suspicion forged into a mob. There were no apologies offered, but in the averted eyes and the grim, pale faces, there was a palpable sense of collective shame and a chilling understanding of what they had almost become. In the quiet aftermath, Silas and Alara stood together, not as celebrated heroes, but as weary, wounded survivors. They had won their lives and their freedom, but Redemption Creek was now poisoned for them. The town would forever be a reminder of their trauma, a graveyard of their stolen peace. Before they left, Silas took Alara to a hidden, overgrown plot of land miles away from the town, a place he had not visited in years. Here, beneath two simple, weathered wooden markers, lay his wife and child. For the very first time, he told her the full story of the fire, of his own terrible helplessness as he had been away on a cattle drive, of the guilt that had been his constant companion ever since. It was his final, most painful confession, a sharing of the ghost that had driven him for so long. She listened, her hand held tightly in his, her quiet, steady presence a silent promise that he would no longer have to carry his grief alone. Their departure was quiet and unceremonious, with the wages Abel Henderson insisted he take. They purchased a small, sturdy wagon and a few essential supplies. The old rancher was the only one there to see them off. He shook Silas's hand firmly and gave Alara a respectful, sad nod. As they rode out of the valley, the sun was setting behind them, casting their long shadows far ahead on the trail. They did not look back. Their future was an unmarked territory, a vast and uncertain horizon. They were scarred, and the ghosts of their pasts would ride with them, always. But they were together, and their love, a thing forged in the crucible of tragedy, prejudice, and violence, was now their only map and their truest compass. It was a fragile but defiant glimmer of hope against the encroaching dark of a new wilderness. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.